Japan has the cleanest streets of any major economy on Earth. Its trains run on time, not just most of the time, but with delays measured in seconds. Walk into any convenience store at 2 a.m. and the shelves are full. The food is fresh and someone is there to serve you. Unemployment is effectively zero. Life expectancy is among the highest ever recorded for a human population. For 30 years, the rest of the world has been calling this a failure. Did we actually misunderstand Japan's economy? There is a number that has followed Japan like a verdict: GDP growth. For 3 decades, it barely moved. The 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010s, flat, flat, flat. And economists, journalists, textbooks all arrived at the same conclusion. Japan lost. It stagnated. It became a warning. The story was so clean and so repeatable that it stopped being examined. But here's where it gets complicated. GDP measures output. It counts what a country produces and sells. It does not count how stable your job is. It does not count whether your city is safe at 3 a.m. It does not count whether the people at the bottom of the economy stayed there or fell through entirely. It is a scoreboard designed for one kind of game. And Japan, it turns out, may have been playing a different game. To understand what actually happened, you need to go back to the moment the verdict was written. 1991. Japan's asset bubble, one of the largest in modern economic history, collapses. Property values fall. Stock markets fall. Banks are left holding loans that will never be repaid. In Tokyo, a patch of land near the Imperial Palace was, at the peak, worth more than the entire state of California. Then it wasn't. By any conventional measure, this is a crisis. The question is, what you do next? The United States, the IMF, Western economists, they had an answer. Cut the bad debt. Let the weak companies fail. Accept the short-term pain, restructure fast, and grow again. Japan looked at that prescription and largely refused it. Instead, Japanese banks kept lending to companies that probably should have closed. The government kept spending to keep unemployment down. It ran deficits year after year, not because it had lost control, but because it made a calculation. The cost of mass unemployment and social disruption would be higher than the cost of carrying the debt. Policymakers made a quiet, deliberate choice. Protect people's jobs and daily lives, even at the cost of the growth numbers. The economist Richard Koo watched this happen from inside Japan, working at the Nomura Research Institute throughout the 1990s. He later developed a framework he called the balance sheet recession. The idea was this: when an asset bubble collapses, companies and households don't behave the way economics textbooks expect them to. Instead of borrowing and investing, they spend every spare yen paying down debt, even when interest rates fall to zero, even when money is essentially free. The problem is not the cost of credit. The problem is that nobody wants more of it. In that situation, the standard prescription, cut rates, wait for investment to return, does nothing. Government spending is the only thing keeping the floor from disappearing entirely. Koo argued that Japan wasn't failing to recover, it was preventing something considerably worse. And the evidence for how much worse it could have been is sitting right there in the comparison. The United States in 2008, facing a structurally similar collapse, implemented many of the aggressive restructuring measures Japan had been criticized for avoiding, and still produced the worst unemployment crisis in a generation. that's not the whole story.
The companies kept alive by cheaper credit, what economists eventually called zombie companies, did cause real damage. By some estimates, by the early 2000s, roughly a third of Japanese-listed companies qualified as zombies, technically insolvent, kept breathing by bank loans they could not repay and would not have received in a healthy market. They blocked new businesses from entering markets. They tied up capital that could have funded something better. They kept people employed in industries that were no longer viable, which meant those people never moved to industries that were.
Deflation added its own quiet trap. When prices fall year after year, and in Japan they fell for most of 2 decades, a strange psychology takes hold. Why buy a car today if it will cost less next year? Why invest in new equipment if the revenue it generates will be worth less by the time it arrives? Deflation sounds like a small technical problem. It functions like a slow leak in the entire economy's motivation to do anything. Japan knew this was happening. It could not find a way out. And then there was the demographic reality that almost nobody in the Western analysis bothered to fold in. Japan's population started shrinking. Not declining in growth rate, actually shrinking. Fewer people means fewer consumers, fewer workers, fewer transactions. A country with a falling population will produce a falling GDP almost automatically, regardless of how well or badly the underlying economy is functioning. Comparing Japan's growth numbers to the United States or Germany without adjusting for population change is not analysis, it is arithmetic presented as verdict. But here's the part nobody talks about. While Japan's GDP flatlined, something else was happening. Employment stayed high, consistently, stubbornly, almost improbably high. In the depths of what the West was calling a lost decade, Japanese unemployment peaked at around 5%. In the United States, during its own financial crisis 20 years later, unemployment hit 10. In Spain, during the same period, it hit 26. Japan's social fabric, the thing that is almost impossible to measure and almost impossible to rebuild once it tears, stayed intact. Life expectancy kept rising. By 2000, Japan had the highest life expectancy on Earth. By 2010, it still did. Poverty rates stayed low by rich world standards. Crime fell, not held steady, actually fell throughout the lost decades. The physical infrastructure of Japanese cities continued to function, and in many cases improve. The experience of being an ordinary person in Japan during the so-called lost decades was, by most measurable human indicators, remarkably stable. Not exciting, not the story of a boom, but stable in a way that very few economies, before or since, have managed during a comparable financial disruption. This is where the question gets harder. There is an economist named Takatoshi Ito, one of the most respected voices on the Japanese economy, a former deputy vice minister at Japan's Ministry of Finance, who has spent much of his career making a point that tends to get lost in the Western framing of this story. Japan's response to its crisis was not irrational. It was not incompetence. It was a reflection of what Japanese society was actually trying to protect. Not the growth rate, not the stock market. The system of lifetime employment. The idea, embedded deep in post-war Japanese culture, that if you gave your working life to a company, the company did not abandon you when things got hard. The social contract between institutions and the people inside them. The conviction that economic disruption should not mean that ordinary people lose everything, while balance sheets restructure around them. You can disagree with that priority. Many economists do. The counter-argument is real. Protecting the old contract meant younger Japanese workers entering a labour market that had no room for them. locked out by a system designed for the generation before theirs.
Japan's youth unemployment and its culture of precarious contract work are direct consequences of choices made in the 1990s. The costs of those choices were real, and they were not evenly shared. But it is worth sitting with the fact that those were choices, conscious ones, made by a society with a specific history, and that the world labelled them failure from the outside, using a metric that society was never primarily optimising for. Here's what that means. GDP became the global default measure of economic success, not because someone proved it was the best measure. It became the default because the countries that promoted it most aggressively were also the countries with the most influence over how the world talked about economics after 1945.
Simon Kuznets, the economist who developed the national account system GDP is built on, warned in 1934 that the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income. He said that before the metric was fully adopted. The warning was noted, then it was filed away. Japan's 3 decades of low growth look like failure on that scoreboard. On a different scoreboard, one that weights employment stability, public safety, physical infrastructure, health outcomes, and social cohesion, they look considerably more complicated. And this matters beyond Japan. South Korea is now watching its own birth rate collapse under the pressure of an economic model that demands total commitment from workers and returns precarity. China is managing a property bubble whose unwinding rhymes uncomfortably with Tokyo in 1991. Several countries across Southeast Asia are navigating the same core question. What do you optimize for? And who gets to define what success looks like from the outside? The lost decade framing was exported as a cautionary tale. What it may actually be is a case study in a different set of choices, with a different set of costs and a different set of things preserved. Japan did not emerge from its lost decades with the growth numbers the textbooks wanted. It emerged with its cities intact, its employment high, its people fed and safe and living longer than almost anyone on Earth. Whether that is a failure depends entirely on what you think an economy is for. That question doesn't have a clean answer. Japan didn't resolve it. It just lived inside it for 30 years, while the rest of the world watched and wrote the verdict too early. Maybe we still are. The next time you read a headline about an economy in decline, any economy, anywhere, ask yourself one question before you accept the verdict. Decline by whose measure and designed for whose priorities? That question will take you further than the headline ever intended to go.